Hi everybody, my name is Hannah and this is Pepper and Pine. Welcome to this series where we are exploring kindergarten through grade 8. Today we are talking about 6th grade and the 12-year-old child. This is a very exciting year, but it does pose a few challenges. Now that the student is in middle school, the curriculum supports that development with new approaches to the lessons as well as main lesson blocks that look remarkably different from the main lesson blocks in the previous years. In the first couple of years of the curriculum, we're looking at subject areas that are building these foundational skills in reading, writing, and arithmetic. So students age 7 in grade 1 are coming to school for the first time in an academic setting. Now, yes, some students may have had some academic rigor prior to first grade, but for the most part, this is the age of learning. And not just learning, but learning through images in a pictorial sense, as students in that age group between 7 and 14 learn through whole picture images. And we're really looking for stories that meet the student not just from a developmental perspective, but also for their feelings. So in the first couple of years, you're going to have several main lesson blocks in writing and reading, arithmetic, form drawing, and these are going to come in the form of an introduction to the letters of the alphabet. They're going to come to you in the form of stories in Native American legends and animal fables, and in Norse mythology, for instance, in grade 4. And these are going to support the language development for the student. These are the stories used in the language arts material and curriculum. In math, students are learning basic number sense. By the time they get to 3rd grade, they're learning some practical math as well, with telling time, measurement math, and money math. And this is really appropriate for that 9-year-old child who is going through a very pivotal developmental change, which is a little bit tumultuous, and that's the 9-year change. And if you want to learn more about that, you can check out the 3rd grade video that's linked in the description box below if you want a little more information on that particular time period. It's both disruptive, but so important for a child's development. Once you get into grade 4 and 5, I look at these as transitional years. The history and the science are starting to develop into more recognizable history main lesson blocks and more recognizable science main lesson blocks. Now in grade 4, the man and animal block, often called the zoology block, is actually a little different than a typical approach to zoology. Zoology is reserved for the upper grades, like in high school, where there's more of a scientific approach to categorization of the animal kingdom. But in grade 4, the man and animal block is a bit more of a spiritual encounter with the animal kingdom. And so the lessons are going to reflect that very particular aspect of the Waldorf pedagogy. In grade 5, you're looking at botany, which is a life science which is very different than the sciences that are going to follow in middle school. So you have a trajectory of these sciences that coordinate with the different kingdoms. And this is important to understand because you're going to see that same reflection in other areas of the education. So you're starting with the animal kingdom for the first, I'm going to call it the first official science block. Now there is nature study before that, but nature study is presented in a story format with stories from, say, the Native American legends. For instance, you're doing a lot of nature walks. You're bringing in those found treasures in nature into the classroom for a nature table. But students are really just one with the environment. And this is very important to build that solid relationship with the natural world before you actually start to examine it from a scientific perspective. And yet that scientific perspective is really reserved for high school from the Waldorf perspective, but we're going to inch our way slowly and carefully and always in support of the development of the child. So in grade 4, we're starting with the zoology block, or really the man and animal block, so we're approaching the animal kingdom. Following that, we're looking at botany, and so now we're interacting with the plant kingdom. By the time you get to grade 6, we're finally interacting with the mineral kingdom, with mineralogy, not to be mistaken with geology, which is reserved for 9th grade. That same representation of first beginning with the animal kingdom before moving on to the plant kingdom and the mineral kingdom is reflected in the materials that you'll see that are prioritized in the younger grades. So always in a Waldorf setting, we are prioritizing natural materials over non-natural materials, and that's a whole discussion in and of itself. And I will save that for another time, because really, if it comes from the earth, is it not natural? But there is an emphasis and a priority on things that come from the animal kingdom first. So we're looking at wool primarily in the younger grades versus cotton, for instance. And then when we're moving into other materials like wood, is prioritized over metals or stone. And so the introduction of the mineral kingdom as the sciences is the last after the introduction of a more formal introduction of the animal kingdom, followed by the plant kingdom. And here's what's beautifully curious is that we're going to circle back to the animal kingdom in a way with our hygiene and anatomy units or main lesson blocks that are going to be later on in middle school. So we're looking at this transition in 4th and 5th grade prior to moving into middle school, where the subjects are going to look, again, remarkably different. How are they going to look different? The way they look different is when we look in comparison to what the students had as main lesson blocks, especially in grade 4 and 5. So those science blocks in grade 4 and 5 were life sciences, and the presentation or the expectations of the student was more of a reflection or an observation, an introduction to the animal kingdom through very specific categorizations, and then to the plant world through watching, in a way, the evolution of the plant world from very simple, well, you first begin with the whole plant, because there is an emphasis on beginning with the whole before going to the parts. So you're seeing the whole plant first before you start to examine parts of the plant. So you're looking at, say, algae or fungus, and then lichen, which is a combination of the two, before going into more primitive plants like ferns and horsetail and conifers, before getting to the complete plant or flowering plants with fruit. So we see this evolution of plants in a sense that mirrors how plants developed over time on this planet. The difference that you're going to see between those life sciences versus the sciences that you will encounter in middle school is that as you move into the physics, for instance, the physics main lesson block or the chemistry main lesson block, we're looking at observing natural phenomena and then recapitulating what was observed and then writing it up in your main lesson book. Rarely do we do a lab report, but that is an option on occasion. Mineralogy, in a way, sits right between the two, between finishing off these life sciences where there's more of an introduction, a reflection, a learning and an understanding in a very purposeful way before moving into the observations of the phenomena, which are performed through demonstrations rather than experiments. Mineralogy now is a science that has to do with the things that are not alive. They are dead materials, or rather than saying they're dead materials, they're materials that are not alive, but they're really important in the construct of the planet itself, and they're really important in our bodies. Our bones, we could sort of relate to the mineral world because of the way that they are constructed. They are hard, and though there is life within it, the materials that make up this are part of the mineral world, the mineral kingdom. And we would not be able to function without our bones. It provides our structure and our stability. So for the sciences, we're looking at an introduction to the sciences in a slightly more scientific way, still holding on to the entire Waldorf pedagogy. And I'm going to go into the mineralogy main lesson block a little bit more, but I want to also explain the difference in the history main lesson blocks and what you can expect and why it is important to do the history in this way to support the development of the child or the student at this point, because they are coming out of that 9-year change, coming out of this moment of golden childhood is what we consider the fifth grade year, where things are just in perfect harmony and balance. 6th grade, we're moving closer to puberty, and some students may have already reached puberty by 6th grade, but there is this new sort of upheaval that is happening within the student. And in all of childhood, there are 3 really pivotal developmental changes that are, those transitions are quite disruptive for the student, and puberty is definitely one of them. The 9-year change is another one. And the first one is one that I've never talked about because it's prior to the education, the formal or informal education of the child. And that's the maybe 2.5 to 3 year developmental shift where children finally identify themselves as the I, like I versus like in the third person. Like if I were like a 2-year-old saying, Hannah wants this, Hannah wants that, versus a 3-year-old who says, I want this or I want that. So those are the 3 very pivotal, very, in a way, disruptive, because it's changing that norm in a very stark way, very intentional way. And then you're on the other side of that in a as if the world is brand new and you are brand new. So very challenging, on occasion, very, very challenging transitions. So this 6th grader is moving into that. At 12 years old, they're moving into that somewhat of a chaos happening inside them and needing this structure and justice and laws and fairness on the outside. They're seeking that in order to balance some of what's going on the inside. They're really striving for that now, whereas that probably wasn't as important to them prior. Fairness, I feel, is something that's important from the time children are very young, but this need for law and order, which the Roman main lesson block or the ancient Rome main lesson block really satisfies that need for that student. So what is happening with history? How is it different from the history that the students had received prior to 6th grade? Because at this point, 6th grade really marks an important change in the curriculum. From an observational perspective, it really marks a significant change. And that's where we're now finally studying history that is from recorded sources. And I will talk about 5th grade history because it is also from recorded histories, but the presentation's a little bit different. In 6th grade, we're finally working from recorded historical sources. We're looking at events, people in history, and circumstances that affected other events that get us to modern history. So very relevant for where we're at today. This history that we're studying is in that line, is in that historical line that can really affect us today. Ancient history we don't have that clear line of how it affects us today, but starting with, and this is for the Western world, starting with ancient Rome, or Roman history, and into the Middle Ages, and finally into the Renaissance and Age of Discovery, all of that directly impacts the Western history. So what's happening in 5th grade versus 6th grade, or even 4th grade? It really requires us to go a little bit further back to see what's going on in 1st grade, because 1st grade, there is no history. So what sources are being taught in 1st grade and in 2nd grade and in 3rd grade that sort of start to form this history vein? Now, this is a personal reflection that I have. It's my personal opinion of how I see the history block evolving through the grades. And so this is just my interpretation of what I see. What I see is in grade 1, and we have to also remember that in a Waldorf setting with the main lesson blocks, when we are teaching a language arts main lesson block, and they're rarely called language arts, but they are the main lesson blocks that are going to work on grammar, spelling, writing, composition, narration. That main lesson block requires content, and that content generally comes from another main lesson block because there's a lot of overlap and cohesion between the main lesson blocks. So there may be a main lesson block in, let's take third grade, for instance, in the story of Prophet Musa alayhi salam, or Moses. That content, those stories are going to make up the content for the language arts main lesson block. So when students are writing or say doing copy work, they will be using the text from those stories that they studied. In grade 1, the stories are of the fairy tales. In grade 2, we have the stories of the Native American legends or animal fables. In grade 3, we move into the story of Prophet Musa or Moses and stories of the saints. And I'm sharing what the trajectory is from the Waldorf perspective. We didn't always do these lessons. We often tailored these lessons to suit our family's needs, culturally and religiously. And so while we may have explored the fairy tales at some point, very quickly we shifted those stories to include stories that were relevant for us. In grade 4, we're looking at Norse mythology. And so here's our first introduction to somewhat recorded history, not the mythology, but the time period. Now, it's arguable whether Musa alayhi salam, would be considered recorded history from a historical sense, even though many people believe this to be true, and as a Muslim, this is 100% true, but I can understand from a historical perspective, especially using it within a school, how those stories may not be considered history. They would just be considered stories that have very deep, important meanings. When you move into grade 4 and Norse mythology, we're looking at a particular time period. However, that time period and that history is not discussed with Norse mythology. We're just looking at the stories of those characters and the wisdom behind those stories. And those stories really appeal to the grade 4 student. And once again, we may have chosen those stories, but we also chose other stories that supported our religious teachings. So you're not getting history yet in grade 4. Grade 5 is the first time you get history, but the way that it's presented is very different than the history that you're going to get following grade 5. Grade 5 is history heavy in my opinion, and we're looking at the ancient civilizations. So we have ancient Mesopotamia and India and Persia and Egypt, and if there's time, ancient Greece, to do the ancient Greece mythology and potentially ancient Roman mythology, but there's so much history in grade 5 that some of those history blocks are moved to grade 6 because there is a Greece main lesson block and a Rome main lesson block for grade 6. But we're looking more at the history for those two main lesson blocks rather than the mythologies. So grade 5 really focuses on the creation stories, on these cultures, on their beliefs. That's what makes up those ancient civilizations. Lots of stories that, of course, have profound and deep meanings, and we did include a lot of them as well. But it's important to understand the purpose of this transitional year before getting into recorded history that has a direct result on modern history. Because there are many sources really in the ancient civilizations that are drawn from a few recorded sources that are still available today. But for the most part, we're looking at these histories from a cultural perspective and, more importantly, from a belief perspective. What did these different people believe in? And that's when you dive into the belief, their creation story, and then the stories that follow. In grade 6, we're moving into recorded historical sources with particular events, structures of government, battles and wars, and we're still going to look at what people believe. That's still going to be something that's important in each of these different historical blocks, but it's also replaced now with these grand events that actually really appeal to children this age as well. So those two focuses, the history and the science, we really see a remarkable difference in the content. And I'll share a little bit more about how these lessons are presented, because it does change a little bit between grade 5 and grade 6. Between grade 5 and grade 6, there's also another smaller developmental milestone. There are the really big milestones every 7 years, but within these 7-year blocks, there are also smaller and yet very significant developmental changes. So around 11, 12 years old, students have the beginnings of puberty and adolescence. Now, it's not complete, and of course, we're looking at these things as transitions, and they occur over time. But what we see with this student now is a greater capacity for moving towards the intellect, and they're not quite ready for the critical thinking and the abstract thinking, but they're moving in that direction. Puberty is upon them. For that reason, we're looking at a different approach to the main lesson blocks and different lessons to support that transition. They don't need the same stories that they needed before, even though many of these lessons are presented in a pictorial sense with a story. And that's still a big aim for teachers and parents to present these stories in a way that can relate to that student in their mode of learning, which is still through images and whole picture ideas. The main lesson blocks you can expect in grade 6 are 3 history main lesson blocks. We have ancient Greece, or the Greece main lesson block, ancient Rome, or the Rome main lesson block, and the Middle Ages. Now, the way that the blocks cycle through are they're about 6 weeks blocks, but we tend to break them up into 2 smaller blocks. So a max amount of time you want to spend on a main lesson block is about 3 to 4 weeks. Now, prior to this time period, or rather prior to grade 6, in my experience and opinion, it was pretty easy to complete a block in 3 to 4 weeks. Even if we had multiple blocks, it felt like it was a good stopping point. Now, rarely was I able to really get everything done in 3 to 4 weeks. Oftentimes, our blocks sort of spread out way longer than intended. And oftentimes we were doing main lesson blocks, or really more appropriately, unit studies, so it could appeal to multiple students, multiple ages, multiple abilities, just because I was homeschooling multiple grades, and that just worked for us. But if you're looking at more specifically what you would expect just in grade 6 versus what you would expect in grade 3, 4, or 5, those blocks in grade 3, 4, or 5, I felt like they were a little bit easier to contain within 3 to 4 weeks. As we move into these history blocks and the science blocks, but specifically the history blocks, we're looking at a lot more resources, more time to cover. We're not just looking at belief systems, but we're looking at really major historical events. We absolutely could not get them done in the time allotted for each of these main lesson blocks. But as a homeschooler, that was okay. We were able to extend our year, or have some of these lessons roll over into other years, or combine them with other grades. In some way or another, we still got through a lot of these main lesson blocks, and oftentimes we made them more whole, more robust than what was initially intended, especially with the Middle Ages main lesson block. We ended up including so many other locations, cultures, time periods, and events. So our Middle Ages main lesson block ended up being probably 6 different main lesson blocks. On the Silk Road, we had an Islamic main lesson block as well. On the Golden Age of Islam, we had a North Africa and a West Africa and an Asia. And so all of those main lesson blocks, or unit studies rather, are linked in the description box below in case you're interested. It really rounded out our Middle Ages main lesson block to include other areas of the world and things that were significant for us, again, in our family, and to not make the curriculum so Eurocentric, which at its core, it is not supposed to be Eurocentric. It is really supposed to be a reflection of the area and the culture that you live in. So those 3 main lesson blocks, Rome, Greece, and Middle Ages, it was impossible to do in 6 weeks. But if you're trying to do them in 6 weeks, I would say stick pretty closely to a curriculum that will help you stay on task, and also split them up into 2 main lesson blocks of about 3 to 4 weeks each, and separate them with another main lesson block. This really helps the student process the information, to digest that information, and to really come to it after that main lesson block, or when the second main lesson block is being addressed. It really allows that information that was that was learned prior to come through in a deeper sense, because you've had time to rest on it, to process it. And this is such an important part of education that we often forget about, especially as teachers or parents who have already processed this information. And the best way I can really invite you to have a little more understanding or compassion for the effort that it takes a student to learn and to contemplate and to digest is really to take a class as an adult. And I say this because I am currently in a couple of classes and I'm learning information. Some of it's familiar, but the majority of it is brand new. And I feel like the class is going too quickly. And this is multiple classes that I'm in. I feel like it's going too quickly. We have way too much information that we have to process. And I really need a big chunk of time to slow down and to really process that information and to ponder it, to think about it, to share it before I can really have opinions about it, to be honest, and to move forward with it. So once again, these students are going through so much information. Having that time to break and address a different topic entirely is very helpful for them. The ancient Greece main lesson block is going to appeal to the students who still have that desire for culture and beauty and art, because that's really a quality of the ancient Greece main lesson block. And it's not to undermine or to overshadow the important qualities in politics and in achievements in Alexander the Great, for instance, but we're looking at a quality of that whole entire time period different from the quality of ancient Rome, which will follow. In ancient Rome, this really appeals to students' need for fairness and justice and structure. And we're looking at this beautiful representation of politics. And by beautiful, I mean very refined in its sense. Ancient Rome had many problems. And as you dive into the history, that comes to light very quickly and very easily. But we're looking at a political system, we're looking at laws, order, justice in a way. And of course, this invites a lot of discussion. This is not by any means the golden standard. However, it is important to learn about this if you live in the Western world, because this does inform politics today, or at least the political structure today. As well, we don't want to undermine the beauty from the Roman times, because you have architecture and art and design, aqueducts and city planning, all of these really beautiful aspects of this time period. And that's going to be reflected in the art that you can do for this main lesson block, and the art that you're going to see reflected in the geometry main lesson block, which is one of the math main lesson blocks for this year. Let's move into the science main lesson blocks. the science main lesson blocks for this grade, and also I feel like the science main lesson blocks become more robust starting in middle school. But there are 3 science main lesson blocks for grade 6. It feels like for grade 6 there is so many main lesson blocks, and they're not light, they're very dense in the sense that you're covering a lot of information, that you have to be really prepared in order to cover all of this material, or in some ways, especially as a homeschooler, maybe extend a little bit at the end of the year, or maybe start a little bit earlier in the beginning of the year, or maybe even work through some of your breaks in order to get through all of the content. And I have opinions about working through summer vacation, but I don't mind working through typical breaks in the school year. But I do mind working through summer. I would much prefer that students have a full summer off completely from school. And yet at the same time, there have been many occasions where we have had to work through our summer vacations. Looking at the science main lesson blocks, we have mineralogy, we have astronomy, and we have physics. Now, physics is going to be a 3-year approach. There are going to be physics main lesson blocks in grade 6, which focus on heat, light, and sound. There will be another physics main lesson block in grade 7 that focuses on electricity and magnetism, and yet another one in grade 8 that's on forces and motion. So there's a lot for physics. There's also a lot for chemistry. Sometimes chemistry is introduced in grade 6, but mostly I've seen it for grade 7 and grade 8. And those are going to be main lesson blocks that follow, in a way, a similar presentation to the physics main lesson block. And then we also have anatomy and hygiene that are going to be coming up. But for this year, we have astronomy, which in some cases I've seen part of astronomy be done in 5th grade, and then the other half of astronomy done in 6th grade. And if you have time in 5th grade, although there are so many history main lesson blocks, I don't know how we could squeeze any more time out of that year. And then of course we have our mineralogy main lesson block, which I began with at the start of this exploration of grade 6. But let's go back to the mineralogy main lesson block and see how that's going to be different from the previous main lesson block approaches, what's going to be covered, and how these lessons are going to be presented. This is going to be different from the main lesson blocks prior in science, because we're finally looking at the mineral kingdom, whereas prior to this we looked at the animal kingdom and the plant kingdom. The mineral kingdom is we can imagine it as the bones of this earth or of this planet. Much of this world is made up of the mineral kingdom. The mineral kingdom in the Waldorf perspective, or rather in this main lesson block presentation, is done very different from a geology unit study or geology main lesson block, or the way geology will be addressed in high school. And that's because geology and mineralogy are quite different. And they're different because the student is different. And the student is different because of their developmental stages. So in grade 6, while some students may be approaching puberty, the whole process of puberty and what that does to the mental development of that student means that geology is best reserved for 9th grade post-puberty for that 14, 15-year-old student, where they're able to use their faculties of critical thinking and abstraction and analogy far better than what they could do before, or really what they're just not capable because they're not quite developed for that capacity just yet. And this means that in your presentation of geology versus mineralogy is that you're not going to be talking about the earth in any aspect that is unseen to the student. And granted, I have done a lot of this anyway, but I want to be very specific on what the Waldorf pedagogy showcases for mineralogy separate from geology, because I do have videos of, like, say, doing the layers of the earth with a felted project, and really that exploration is better served for students post elementary, so in high school or post puberty. And that's because we're really calling on the student to extrapolate what could be these different layers of the earth. And to be honest, there's actually some debate with among scientists on what these different layers really are composed of and what it entails. So what we're really doing for grade 6 is looking at mineralogy, or the mineral kingdom, from the perspective of the student, what they can see and what they can observe and what they can interact with. Different from geology, which might talk about time, and granted, again, we've done a little bit of this as well, talking about time periods that are out of the scope of reason and understanding. When we're looking at millions of years or hundreds of millions of years or even a billion years in the past, looking at the geological time, that is such an abstract concept for a child to understand. And to be honest, it's even a little bit difficult for an adult to understand as well. These are tremendously long time periods that were necessary in order to get the planet to where it is today. Those are geological timescales that are best reserved for a geology study. So mineralogy is going to look at what is in the student's sphere of understanding. And again, beginning with the whole before moving to the parts. Beginning with the whole before moving to the parts is a Waldorf pedagogical principle that you're going to see repeated often in all of the years. And in most of the main lesson blocks, you're going to see this effort to look at the whole before the parts. And as an example, in the previous science main lesson blocks of botany, we started with the whole plant before moving to the parts. And really by moving to the parts, I mean looking at the leaf or the flower or the fruit or the root system or the stem. And there are plants that are, they look like they are all one of those different parts. And that's the whole evolution of the lessons, is like looking at something that just looks like a big leaf and it's an entire plant, but it's an algae, for instance. In grade 4, when we were looking at the man and animal block, we were beginning with the complete human being. That was the whole that we were looking at. Not the whole of the animal kingdom, but the whole of the human being. And this was important for two aspects. One is that the human being, from the Waldorf perspective, is a compilation of the entire animal kingdom. And the animal kingdom, each animal or each group of animals, and there's also archetypal animals as well, but they represent a part of the human being. And so to begin with the whole human being, we're starting with the whole, but we're also starting with something that is incredibly relevant to the student because they are a whole human being. So when you begin with yourself before moving into the animal kingdom, there is a relationship there. And you're beginning with the whole. How do you begin with the whole when it comes to the mineralogy main lesson block? What I love about this approach, and I really didn't understand it until probably the third or fourth time I was approaching the mineralogy main lesson block. I think primarily because of my inability to understand this beautiful approach. We resorted mostly to a geology unit study and mostly to hands-on activities. But when we approach the mineralogy main lesson block, beginning with the whole and moving to the parts, we're looking at the whole of something. But what is the whole of something? Is it the whole planet? Looking at the whole planet is a bit abstract for the student, so that's not going to work. So what are we going to look at the whole of? So we look at the whole of two very well-chosen archetypal rocks, a fire rock, granite, and the water rock, limestone. And I love this presentation so much. You have these two polar opposites. What's in the middle? You have metamorphic rock in the middle, but we're gonna look at these two very polarizing, distinctive rocks. The granite, which is a whole rock with lots of minerals in and of itself, but that's created from fire. And limestone, which is again a composition of a lot of different things. It's a sedimentary rock composed primarily within water. I love this approach so much. And we're looking again, and the theme of duality begins in grade 1, and it has this subtle like ebb and flow throughout the grades. And so I love that here you can see a little bit of duality, but you're going to find the balance with the third rock, the metamorphic rock. And it's so important to see that balance and see the whole rock cycle, but we're not approaching that just yet. There is this intuitive idea of like these two very distinct and very different polar opposite types of rocks. And we're seeing that polarity in other areas, especially in the Rome main lesson block. When you see the justice scale, it actually is two polar opposites balanced by a third. You can't have balance between these two polar opposites without a third component. And so again, you're seeing a lot of these polarities examined, but with this third being brought in to truly bring balance and harmony between those two polar opposites. So we're beginning with the whole, and the whole is granite. And if you bring a piece of granite to the classroom, you'll be able to examine it more closely and see that it's actually made up of these different minerals, these different crystals. You see quartz, you see mica, you see feldspar, and these pieces make up this whole granite. And so rather than talking about those individual minerals, we're looking at the whole piece of granite first and then examining the parts. So once you see the whole picture first, and this is really important for students at this age, they really need to see the whole thing first before going into the parts. And this is a very subtle but yet distinctive aspect of the education that can really help students at this age. Later on, you may be able to begin with the parts and then move to the whole, but overall, I feel like it is a natural human disposition to think about the whole unit before the parts. And I'll give you a very simple example. I'm going to prepare dinner. I'm rarely thinking like, well, I have garbanzo beans and I have a fillet of fish and I have a bell pepper. What can I make with this? Now, granted, some chefs can do that beautifully, but for the most part, I'm imagining I would like to make tortilla soup for dinner. What are the pieces that I need in order to create this meal? Now, I may have them, or I may need to go to the grocery store, or maybe that's what I do when I go to the grocery store is create a list based on the meals that I'm going to make, which is the whole, and then I examine that I need these different parts, so I'm going to the grocery store to buy these different parts. Once again, we're looking at the whole in our mineralogy unit, looking at granite and then decomposing and looking at the different parts that make that up. And this is the fire rock. Then we can look at the limestone, and that's the water rock. And this is a really beautiful exploration of examining how limestone is created through a vast period of time, but granite actually is also created over a long period of time. Granite's very different as an intrusive rock versus an extrusive rock like obsidian or pumice. They're remarkably different visually and in their characteristics and in the time it takes to actually form these rocks. Pumice can be formed very quickly and very easily. Now, I shouldn't say very easily, but very quickly, compared to granite, which takes a very long time to produce. It must cool down slowly in order for those minerals to come together and form those crystals. Now we're going to look at limestone. Once again, this is a rock that takes a very long period of time in order to create, and it has to be done in water, and it has to be done with tiny, tiny little organisms that are growing and living in that water. They live and they die, and then those little bodies fall to the bottom of the ocean floor and get compacted over millions of years. And over that time, with that heavy compaction, you end up with limestone. And there are other types of rock like talc and chalk that are part of that whole process. And then beautifully, through the metamorphic process, you can have granite turn into gneiss, and you can have limestone turn into marble. And marble is the material that ancient Greeks used in order to carve their statues and structures and for sculptures. So there's a beautiful tie-in when you're learning about the mineralogy main lesson block or mineralogy world, mineral kingdom, and the production of limestone, and then the way that it changes into marble, and then how that was mined and used by the ancient Greeks. Beautiful. I love when those main lessons really coordinate well. One of the other sciences that I absolutely love, and I have to say that in all of our years of homeschooling, there were certainly some main lesson blocks that we didn't get to. And this is a sad experience for me because some of my students simply did not get the physics main lesson block. 2 of my students did, 2 of my students didn't, for a variety of reasons. But the physics main lesson block is such a beautiful presentation and introduction. We're looking at a very simple categorization for physics. So we have heat or thermodynamics, light or optics, and sound or acoustics. And I like that it starts with heat, light, and sound because it's very simple, it's very basic. We're not going to get too much into these topics where they're going to be more of an advanced presentation of physics. And so the very first lesson actually is pulling out all of the musical instruments that you might have, or just anything that makes noise, and you're really exploring sound in that capacity. How does it sound to you? How do different materials make different sounds? And what's curious is that we have a very attuned sense of hearing. And for instance, we know what glass looks like, and we know what glass should sound like. If you take 2 glass cups and you tap them together, you know what sound to expect. So if you take 2 glass cups and you tap them together and they have a dull, hollow sound, you realize, oh, those weren't glass cups, those were plastic cups. Maybe acrylic, they really look like glass, but they actually weren't glass. So we have a very fine, a refinement to how we hear sound that we have had over all of these years up until 12 years old, up until 6th grade. So exploring those sounds is part of the very first lesson. And then there are optics and heat. And especially in heat, we're going to see a lot of those topic areas revisited in the following year when we are doing combustion with chemistry. For the physics demonstrations or for the physics main lesson block, we're looking at a very different approach to studying science, even from the other main lesson blocks for this year. In mineralogy, we're not really doing demonstrations. There are a few, but for the most part, we're not doing demonstrations. I do love to include hands-on projects. So absolutely, we have a lot of hands-on projects in as many main lesson blocks as possible. I will prioritize our hands-on projects, our field trips, just anything that really gets our whole body involved in the main lesson. But in our physics main lesson block, we're doing demonstrations, and the demonstrations are ones where the teacher will present the demonstration without any explanation. We're just doing the demonstration. And what this does for the student is give them a whole picture of what's happening. And then the teacher will remove the apparatus and the demonstration, and then we will talk through what just happened. And so we're looking again at a very specific Waldorf pedagogical practice and value is looking at the human as a 3-fold human. And this means that we're looking at the thinking, the feeling, and the willing. So the thinking, the feeling, and the doing, if willing doesn't quite make sense. When we present the entire apparatus with the demonstration without any commentary, we're really calling on the students' thinking. We're just getting the whole picture. We're just going to put this entire demonstration there so the student knows what's going on. When the teacher reviews that or talks about it, especially in the following day, we're really calling on the students' feeling, because they're needing to review what's happening, and especially in the history main lesson blocks, which I did not cover this type of presentation, but I will do so shortly. You're calling on a new capacity for the student to review and to bring more life, more feeling to the demonstration or to the lesson. And then when you're actually writing up the lesson and really pondering it on a different level, like you can see something be performed, but when you actually have to write it down, it really calls on not just your will forces, so you're actually doing something, but I find that when I finally get ready to write this down, and honestly, I do a lot of these main lessons the same way that my student does them, so that I have compassion for what my student is going through, so that I have greater understanding of the content. But when I finally get ready to write something down, I really have to make sure, did I understand that correctly? What was that apparatus actually called? Am I spelling this correctly? And it's no longer about sentence structure and narration presentation. Now it's really the content itself, because we've spent the previous years really honing the skills for writing and reading and arithmetic, but writing in particular, so that now you're really making sure that the content itself is of high quality and of high accuracy and precision as well. But we're looking to make sure that we're being accurate in the terminology that we're using, in the spelling of the words, especially new words. We're looking at new main lesson blocks with terminology that students may not have had before. And so we're really calling not just on our will forces, but we're really having to think through this quite deeply. There aren't usually lab reports, but on occasion a teacher may choose to do a lab report. I only did them sparingly with our chemistry main lesson block, which was for 7th and 8th grade. And I did this just so that there was some understanding of what could be expected in 9th grade or 10th grade or beyond. But really, I did not prefer to do our narrations and our illustrations in the form of a lab report. There's one more science main lesson block that I absolutely love for grade 6 that we never missed, and that's the astronomy main lesson block. Now, what I love about the astronomy main lesson block, the way that it's presented, is that once again, we're looking at astronomy from the perspective of what can be perceived from the student's point of view. So we are on the planet Earth. So we're going to look at astronomy to begin with from what we can see in the night sky. What we can see in the night sky to begin with are the constellations. Of course, we can see the moon, we can see some planets, and during the day we can see the sun, of course. And daytime astronomy is also a part of the astronomy main lesson block, and that was actually really important for us as well. So for the astronomy main lesson block, we're looking at what the child can perceive in the night sky to begin with, and those are the constellations. Now, the constellations are very ancient. Many different cultures and civilizations could see the same or similar constellations, and there were different stories that accompanied these constellations. This is a very curious thing that these collection of stars grouped together were seen across the planet over different periods of time, and they contained unique stories. The stories we primarily used were Greek and Roman mythologies, but honestly, I really was looking to explore other cultures and other stories. And so if that's something of that is important to you, especially if you're from a different part of the world and you want to include those stories, then I highly encourage you to do so. Primarily, we had greater access to Greek and Roman mythologies in correlation to those different constellations. And so the very first part of the astronomy main lesson block is exploring those stories and those constellations. And we're in the northern hemisphere, so that we would explore those constellations that are visible in our night sky. Following that introduction, which is the first half of the astronomy main lesson block, comes the second half of the astronomy main lesson block, which is my favorite. And that's where we're going to explore Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler's 3 laws of motion, Tycho Brahe, and the astronomy that's visible to the student before moving to, say, outside the solar system to see the motion, because of course Kepler's 3 laws of motions talking about elliptical motion, and that would be the motion of the planets. They move in ellipses, not in a circular path. You do have to, in a way, sort of step outside of the Earth to look at the solar system from the outside. But we don't want to begin there. We want to begin with what we can actually see. So we're looking at retrograde motion as well. We're looking at where the sun truly rises and sets. We're looking at the highest point the sun reaches in the summer versus in the winter. And this all gives the student some clarity in looking at astronomy, different from astronomy that you can typically see when you're reading books or doing a unit study where it's looking at the planets, for instance, maybe the composition of those planets, the distance from the sun those planets are, how long their revolutions and rotations are. We're not actually going into that with this astronomy main lesson block. What I love about it as well is that we're also looking at history with this main lesson block. And the history actually coordinates with the Middle Ages, or at least the tail end of the Middle Ages, moving right into the Renaissance. Because when we're looking at Tycho Brahe and Copernicus and Galileo, we're looking at roughly the 1300s to about the 1600s or mid 1600s. So that time period is really the tail end of the Middle Ages, moving into the Renaissance, and really a huge scientific cultural shift in how we approach science. So it's a very interesting time period and very revolutionary in a lot of ways. Now, I talked a little bit about the presentation of the lessons for science, and it actually mirrors the presentation of the lessons for history. So I'm going to take a moment to explain how the history lessons are presented different in 6th grade versus in the previous grades. Once again, we're going to present the lesson we want to look at it from an imaginative perspective, a holistic perspective, and through whole images. But the way that it's going to be different in 6th grade is that the very first presentation of a historical period is going to be brief, it's going to be limited on description, it's going to be somewhat of an overview or a preview. And this gives the student a whole picture view of that historical time period or that particular lesson. Once the teacher does this, and this particular part is done on the same day, the teacher will then review that or really begin again, but this time with more descriptions. So that first presentation, which is brief and gives you the whole picture view, again calls on the thinking forces of this threefold human. So it allows the student to use this thinking capacity to get this whole picture view of what's happening. But when the teacher goes again through these lessons, or this lesson in particular, with descriptions, with the different events, the characters, historical figures, but it's the descriptions that are really important. And maybe you get, I don't want to say you get animated, but you might get a little bit excited about the stories. You might just get really into the story itself. This calls on the students' feeling forces. Now you're bringing feeling into the story, into the lesson, because of all the descriptions. Then the lesson ends, and the following day, this would be more of like a 2-day cycle, but really, I imagine it still is a 3 or 4 day cycle. The student has had time to sleep on this, to rest, and to really put that lesson aside. On the second day, that lesson is revisited. This is a time for review. This is a time when you're really calling the students to bring their work to the lesson. They have to review, or even if the teacher is reviewing collectively, the student needs to now process that information, review that information, and then put that information into work that they produce that really calls on the will forces, the doing, the action part of the lesson. Now for us, that action part took several days. There would be a time for writing and a time for illustration. And each of these also calls on different capacities for the student. I think of the illustrations as more of a feeling part of the lesson, and I think of the written portion as more of a willing and a thinking part of the lesson. And so in this way, the student is able to do work that calls on all three parts of their being. And of course, whenever possible, we like to head to the kitchen to bring a food element into our lessons. It's always been memorable and appreciated by my students. And any hands-on projects, I'm very big on the hands-on projects. So whenever that was possible for any of our units, especially history we could do a lot of food with. I found that to be of tremendous value. What other main lesson blocks can you expect for grade 6? There are actually 2 math main lesson blocks, but we only ever did one of them. And I'm going to explain in detail why we avoided doing algebra. We would do an introduction to algebra, which I would really consider pre-algebra. And by pre-algebra, I really mean shoring up all of our basic arithmetic before moving into algebra. So I would do that, but I would not do algebra until mid 8th grade, and really 9th grade is when we really actually dove into algebra. But there is another geometry main lesson block in grade 6. And this really brings me so much joy because I love the introduction of geometry in grade 5. And honestly, you could even do some of these lessons even younger. Whenever I would present our geometry main lesson block, it was always when I had either an older student or a younger student. Yeah, even my last student, I had older students, but it was very sweet. They would participate, but they were done with school. But it brought them so much joy to do the geometry that even on occasion when I was doing this geometry with my youngest student, where my older students were already done completely, there was still like an enjoyment in participating in that geometry. So what can you expect in geometry for grade 5 versus grade 6? How is it different, and what are the lessons? And also, how does it coordinate with the other lessons of this year? In grade 5 geometry, we're looking to begin with as an exploration of just shapes itself. And so the very first lesson is just drawing a lot of straight lines, and this is freehand. We're not using any tools yet. All freehand lines, and eventually those lines intersect, and through those intersections you see these different forms emerge. They could be triangles, they could be squares, polygons. So we're looking at this exploration of like, wow, these shapes are emerging through these straight lines. There's 6 division of a circle in grade 5, which is the easiest of all the divisions of a circle. And even though we did division of a circle from 3 division all the way to 12 division, some of those divisions are better served in grade 6. 6 division and 12 division especially are easy in grade 5. They are the easiest of them, but 5 division of a circle is especially reserved for grade 6, and that one is a little bit more challenging, but we ended up doing a lot of work with 5 division of a circle. Now, 5 division of a circle and 6 division of a circle are going to coordinate with the mineralogy main lesson block. In 6 division of a circle, you see the immersion of a hexagon, and hexagons are seen in certain crystals. You're also going to see 6 division of a circle in botany, especially when we're studying lilies. And so you're seeing 6 division with the petals. And then 5 division of a circle, which we're doing in grade 6, but it's reminiscent of grade 5 in botany, when we're looking at petals, or I'm sorry, well, you can see petals too, but when you're looking at the construction of certain leaves that have 5-fold symmetry. And it's not perfectly a pentagon. It's when you imagine a leaf that has a smaller portion of a leaf at the bottom next to the stem, and then a larger, you can see that 5-fold symmetry, or that 5-fold division. And so once again, you're seeing a correlation and connection to other main lesson blocks, either in that year or in the previous year. So for grade 6 geometry, we're going to begin with circles, freehand circles, and you're going to draw freehand circles until you start to see maybe a better construction of that circle, because you might draw one that looks a little more like an ellipse, or it's just a little bit of a clumsy construction. And then over those lessons, now we're looking at, well, what defines a circle? We're looking now at the terminology. Well, a circle needs to have all the points on the circumference be equal distance from the center. So now we're looking at terminology being built through this experience of drawing circles. 5 division of a circle is really big in grade 6. It takes a little while to master, but once you do, there's a lot that you can do within that. The pentagon and the 5-pointed star, and then different connections between them. And then there's a really great hands-on project with 5 division of a circle where you can make a pentagon where you can make a lantern out of your construction. Geometry is also going to correlate with the Middle Ages main lesson block in different kinds of tiles and patterns that are going to be seen in architecture. So with 6 division of a circle, with 8 division of a circle, which is a little bit more challenging, you're going to see different kinds of tile motifs that are going to especially be in different architectural constructions, especially in areas where there were Muslims. You're going to see a lot of that kind of tile work in the mosques that were constructed. And you're going to see those divisions of a circle, that tile work in other parts of the world as well. So again, a beautiful correlation between the two. I love geometry so much that I have a lot of geometry tutorials for you. In case you're interested, you can find the entire geometry playlist linked in the description box below. I also encourage you to check out the geometry blog post on my website at Pepper and Pine. That link is in the description box below, and I go through 5th grade geometry, division of a circle geometry, 6th grade, and I think there might even be 7th grade geometry in there as well. Geometry is throughout all of the middle school years. It's just that each time geometry is presented, it's presented a little bit differently, and we kind of expand on it. What you're not going to see is Euclidean geometry with proofs and theorems. That is reserved for 9th and 10th grade geometry. The other main lesson block for math is algebra, and it is an introduction to algebra, and then there are some algebra lessons, but we avoided them entirely until about 9th grade. The reason why we avoided them is for 2 reasons. One was that early on in my homeschooling journey, I went to a homeschooling conference, and this is not a Waldorf conference, but I met a teacher who, in essence, said that algebra is best reserved for post-puberty. Now, granted, 7th and 8th grade students could be post-puberty, but I would rather spend that time shoring up our math concepts before moving into algebra in a more rigorous way. Even though our first introduction to algebra is a gentle introduction, and it's usually around 8th grade, but true rigorous high school algebra, we do wait until 9th grade. The reason why this teacher said it's best to save it for post-puberty, and really 8th and 9th grade is like a good time for algebra, and even 9th grade is a little bit better. She said it is quite an abstract math subject area. And a lot of times so let me preface by saying I learned this about 15 to 18 years ago. This teacher had been teaching for probably at least 15 to 20 years. So we're looking at teaching in the 1990s, I think, maybe late 80s. Okay, so that time period. The teacher said that by the time she got students and also early 2000s, I'm sorry, probably 90s and early 2000s. Let me correct that, because I think these conferences were in the early 2000s. She said that by the time she got students in 7th grade, 8th grade for algebra, she needed to undo a lot of the teaching that had been done early on in an inappropriate or ineffective way. Algebra is not intuitive. Algebra is really about balancing equations with an unknown, which is abstract, when you're replacing an unknown with a letter. Or it could be anything, but the point is that you have to balance your equations, and you are searching for an unknown. And it's very different from me saying, for instance, what's 6 times 7? Or 42 is 7 times what? That's a very different math problem. which you can do intuitively. What I mean is that you can work that out in your mind without having to actually balance an equation. When you're doing algebra, now granted, there certainly can be some people who can balance this out on their own mentally, but actually writing this out, and as we move into higher math, it's usually math that you're going to have to write out. What ends up happening is that a lot of times in, say, grade 1 or grade 2, pre-algebra or like algebra or simple algebra is offered in the form of an unknown. You might have, say, 12 equals 9 plus, and then a box. And when you do a lot of math that way, thinking that you're preparing a student for algebra, you're really not. Because a grade 1 student is not going to be balancing those equations. And granted, maybe in some schools they are, but it is not an appropriate or developmentally appropriate lesson to be doing for a grade 1 student. When you get to 7th, 8th, 9th grade algebra, you're looking at algebra from a very abstract perspective. Algebra is itself an abstract math. And to be fair, numbers themselves are abstract and letters are abstract as well. So we could argue a lot of that if you wanted to get to the nitty gritty. In 7th, 8th, and 9th grade, when you're doing algebra, you have to have the cognitive ability to be able to understand what balancing an equation is, to write that out, and it is not intuitive. Now, some basic algebra you might be able to do some mental math basic algebra, no problem. But why that's a problem as you move towards greater and more rigorous algebra is that if you do it that way, it will not serve you later on when the math gets more difficult. You're not going to be able to do the math the same way. You will need to take pencil to paper and start to work out that math. And if you wait longer and longer to do that, it's going to be more and more challenging. And sometimes the challenge itself is enough to turn students off from the subject area. The other reason why I did not choose to do algebra in the Waldorf way is that I found it confusing. And I found it confusing because I feel like there was a big push to present algebra in this pictorial way. And I do recognize this as my own shortcoming. But I did find that there was a big push to present algebra, again, in a pictorial way, story, imaginative, a lot of the principles used that are used between the ages of 7 to 14. And I felt that it was inauthentic to the subject area to push a methodology of teaching onto a subject area that is in and of itself best reserved for post-puberty and really for 9th grade. So I didn't want to artificially bring this subject area in an imaginative way with pictures. And you can see in a lot of curricula, there'll be pictures of showing balancing equations or the pre-algebra will definitely be pictorial. But I felt like if this is in some ways, an abstract concept, an abstract math subject area, it's best suited for that time period when students are capable of doing that. And I can present it in a way that I think it should be presented without all of the pictures. So I want to say this is a point that I'm very passionate about, and I'm passionate about it for a few reasons. One is I think that any kind of educational trauma takes years to undo and to fix. And I never want my students ever feeling incapable, like they cannot do something from an academic sense, feel turned off from it from a capability perspective, not from I'm tired of writing, or I don't want to do this lesson again. That could be laziness, that can be poor habits, that can be just having an off day. I don't mean that at all. What I mean is for a student to engage in a subject area and think that they are incapable, think that in some way they are not smart enough, think in some way that that whole subject area is not for them since they're just not getting it, when really they might not be getting it because they're just not ready for it. I absolutely want to protect that. It's a very strong value of mine, and it's probably why we delayed academics even longer than the Waldorf perspective, and maybe even longer than what would normally be acceptable. I did wait until my students were really ripe for the subject areas. And I don't mean ripe in the sense of, like for history, you can do that for almost any grade level, there's stories, but for the skills, I wanted to make sure that they were really ripe and ready for the skills so that we weren't taking too long in trying to master them, because my time was limited, to be fair, with 4 children homeschooling. Really, that's not even, there are people who homeschool far more students and have other obligations. I mean, I find 4 just kind of in the middle ground, and yet this was so much. So having to be very strategic with my time, very effective. I found that if I waited, if I tried to teach my children how to read when they were 5, 6, or 7, and it would take 3 or 4 years, versus when I started when they were 8, 9, or 10, and it took 3 or 4 weeks, and yet they still learned at the same time that you could have spent 3 or 4 years investing in that. It didn't make sense to me from an educational perspective and from an emotional perspective. So I am very much against trying to present skills and concepts to children that are just beyond their reach, and they have to really strive for it. And you're going to see that a lot in different educational models, and you see that in the Waldorf pedagogy as well, and I disagree with it. I don't think that students need to strive for it. I think they need to be fully developmentally capable so that when they're arriving at those skills and concepts, they are capable of doing it from a developmental perspective. It still doesn't mean that it's not going to be hard. Like, it's still going to be hard, because learning, sometimes I think the initial learning is quite enjoyable and easy, but it's the practice that can be tedious and hard. But that at least they are ready for it, fully ready for it. Not just like I need to practice, or it's just out of my reach, or I'm not quite ready. None of that. And that's the way I feel about algebra. I don't want my children to be traumatized by their algebra experience. And it's not to say that every child would be. It's just that I chose to put it off until they were at an age where that subject could be presented authentically in the way that I think it should be presented, and not really sort of molded into this pedagogy that really strives for a pictorial, holistic, imaginative story form for delivering the lessons. And granted, by the time you're doing algebra, really, algebra can be presented in 6th grade, 7th grade, or 8th grade. And if you had a choice, I'd say 8th grade and even 9th grade. And when we presented algebra, to be fair, it was probably more pre-algebra skills and a very soft introduction to algebra. And we used the Key to Algebra curriculum series workbooks, and then a few other resources, but that was primarily our approach. When you're doing algebra in 9th grade, it's going to be a lot more rigorous. The content itself, the questions itself, it's going to be a lot more rigorous. Imagine this. We're going to do multiplication. We could do 6 times 7 multiplication, 5 times 5 multiplication. It's pretty easy. It's okay. It's an introduction. But what if I was telling you we're going to do multiplication of fractions. We're going to do multiplication of negative numbers. We're going to do multiplication of decimals. Well, that requires a lot more skill. It's a lot more robust look at multiplication. So I envision algebra being the same way. That 6 times 7 multiplication equivalent of algebra is what we would do in 8th grade. That more intense multiplication of fractions and decimals and negative numbers and positive numbers, we would save that for high school. So that's my view on algebra. Very strong views on waiting for that presentation, and strong views on presenting it in, to be honest, a bit more of a dry, analytical way. Certainly math can be imaginative, but I mostly did not present math that way, even though there's probably a lot, and there is a lot of wisdom in presenting it that way. But I prefer to present math, or prefer the children to come to math when they were really ripe and ready for those skills. There's one more main lesson block that I want to share with you before we move into the specialty subject areas, but there is a language arts main lesson block. Now, primarily the language arts main lesson blocks have been, or the content has been part of the history main lesson block or from other stories. As we've moved through the grades, students have learned to master some of the basics in writing, and of course in reading and comprehension and spelling. And so for all of those previous years in building just the skill set for reading and writing, now finally in 6th grade, we can look at exploring style and personalizing the writing process, maybe even some creative writing as well. Because up until this point, students have really mastered, or have really maybe become proficient, maybe not mastered quite yet, a lot of aspects of grammar and sentence structure. And because there's so much narration in all of the main lesson blocks, there should be mastery in being able to listen, comprehend, process, digest, and produce written work based on the lessons. But now in grade 6, we can look at a new part of writing, and that's just the style, the melodiousness of, the sing-song aspects of writing. What's curious about the writing and reading approach in the Waldorf pedagogy is that it's really built upon some, in my opinion, some anthroposophical ideas on life after death. And there are very, very specific ideas of how, first of all, how the body came into existence, what makes up the human body, and that's a fourfold understanding of the body. There's a physical body, the etheric body, which is the life forces, the astral body, which you can imagine as like the desires and the feelings, the emotions, and the ego or the I. So there's this fourfold aspect of the human being, which comes into existence through different births. And then when the person passes away, again, there are these different deaths in essence. And one of the last things to really depart is language will depart immediately. And I just want to share that these are Waldorf ideas that we don't hold as our own, but I thought I'd share them so that you understand why these aspects, or why there's a focus on certain presentations of lessons, and why certain content is taught at certain years. And it's really because of these deeper philosophical ideas. So one of the last things to leave the human soul, in essence, is the vowel sounds, A, E, A, O, U. Prior to that, because language will not still be there, but prior to that, there will still be a melodious side to the language. Imagine like a sing-song aspect, a beauty to the language, a beauty to the sentence structure. That will still reside a little bit, even when language is completely gone. Again, these are not ideas that I hold true for myself based on our religious beliefs. But in grade 6, there is a focus on a personal style to the writing. And this is a great time to explore that individuality, because as students are reaching puberty and moving beyond puberty, there is a greater sense of becoming an individual with your own style, your own perspective, your own ideas, your own opinions. That continues to grow and develop. Prior to the 9-year change, children were one with the world. And prior to the 2.5-year, 3-year change, Children were one with their mothers, like physically, mentally, emotionally, everything. There was really no cognitive separation, even though you can visually see that a baby or a toddler is different from a parent. And the toddler can see the parent. The toddler wants to be with the parent all the time. There's no cognition that they are separate. Separation is an ongoing process. And when the student of 12 years old is approaching puberty, or is in puberty, or is approaching post-puberty as they get older through middle school, there's greater desire for individualization, and it really peaks at around 14 or so, where there is somewhat of a rebellion to everything the young adult has known or come to hold as truth. There is like this momentary separation from all of it before they pick and choose the things that they're going to take as their own, whether it was things that they learned or that were their own when they were younger, or if they're going to be brand new ideas. Let's move on to the specialty subject areas. We have foreign language, we have music, we have handwork, my favorite, and we have eurythmy, among other subject areas as well. These are ones that you're going to often see in a Waldorf brick and mortar school. You don't often see them in a home setting, but some of these are attainable while others are a little bit more challenging. You can certainly have music instruction, and you can certainly have some form of foreign language, especially if you yourself know multiple languages. I highly, highly encourage you to focus on the language that is not part of the country or culture that you live in, because students will absorb so quickly the language of where they live. It'll be much harder to retain the language of their family, or a secondary language that's not part of the language that the country that they're growing up in. Handwork is one of my favorite additional lessons. These specialty subjects are usually done once or twice a week, preferably twice a week. And they do still support the development of the student through all these different developmental stages. And they have different skills that are developed and taught as the students are ready for those new skills. And so in grade 6, for handwork, we're looking at a couple of different things that the student can do. We're looking at either working with 4 needles or multiple needles, knitting needles, in order to knit in the round. And so you can imagine maybe knitting a hat, for instance. Or you're looking at students who are drawing their own patterns in order to make animals. And we've done this before. It's brilliant. It's actually a little bit more challenging. Well, it was more challenging than I expected, but at the same time, it was so doable that I felt very accomplished once I did this as an adult, and then I taught my daughter. I'm not sure that she found it quite as amazing, and for 2 reasons. One, when I did this project in my Waldorf Practical Arts training, and if you want to know more about that, it's linked in the description box below in case you are interested in doing that kind of training. But when I did it, number one, the materials that we used were far better than the materials that I had on hand to teach my daughter. And the other thing is that I chose I did a camel, I also did a hedgehog, and I did a mouse. And all 3 of those were far easier than the animal she chose. She chose a dolphin. And I feel like the complexity of the animal that she chose and the materials that we used meant that it was much more difficult to get to make a project or finish the project in a way that was satisfactory. And we also encountered a lot of problems that were more challenging to get through. So if you were doing this project, a lot of times you'll see students do, like, say, an elephant, for instance, or some kind of animal that has 4 distinct legs. It's not always, but I feel like as a beginner, in my opinion, it was a little bit easier. Or if you're going to do a mouse, for instance, you're not even going to have to deal with the legs. You're just looking at the body of the animal or the silhouette of the animal. And when I did the hedgehog, once again, I'm really looking at the silhouette of the animal, not the details. Once you get the general gesture of the animal, I think it's very easy for you to fill in like what it actually is. You actually don't need a lot of those extra details. So that's something that you're going to find in the middle school years, is an exploration of making your own patterns and producing work from those patterns that you're not copying.